Welcome to Avenue M. My name is Haroon Moghul.
And I'm Joey Taylor.
We're two men on a journey of faith and meaning. In each episode, we sit down with a remarkable guest to unpack the moments that shape us, the struggles that build us, and the questions that intrigue us. Today, we're talking to Richard Reeves, founder and president of the American Institute for Boys and Men. Richard first came to our attention when he raised the alarm about American men. Since Joey and I are both raising boys, we agreed this had to be our first conversation. To begin, we asked Richard to share the moment when he realized all was not well with boys and men in our country and around the world.
Yeah, well, there isn't one, unfortunately. I really wish there was, because it makes it much easier to motivate. But there are a couple. I was working a lot on issues around inequality and upward mobility. That was my previous thing. And there was this really striking finding from researchers led by Raj Chetty and his team out of Harvard. And what they found was that there was no difference in the upward mobility rates of Black and white women, but there was a massive difference in the upward mobility rates of Black and white men. And that you could explain all of the difference in upward mobility rates in the US between Black Americans and white Americans by what was happening to Black men. It's all about the men. And obviously that intersects with race in a very powerful way, but it was my day job to be worrying about that inequality thing. And that kind of never left me, that finding. And then as I got into the work, I kept seeing these data points, but I will say there was a moment, I think I was probably already committed to the project, but when the pandemic first hit, the male college enrollment rate dropped 7 times more than the female one. The female one actually barely budged. It was consistent with the decline in previous years, but in 2020 it just cratered for men for all kinds of complicated reasons. And what struck me about that was less the fact that there was this 7-fold difference, but more the fact that no one was noticing the fact. There was no reporting. None of my colleagues at the Brookings Institution knew that fact, even the ones who worked on higher education. It was on table 3 of a Department for Education report, and it was a real moment where I just thought, you know what, I know we'd be reading about this if it was the other way around. And this is kind of interesting, right? At the very least, policymakers should be thinking, really 7 times more for this group than that group? Nah, we should dig into that. We should look at that. And so that was a real moment for me of like, I was surprised by the extent of that falling in college enrollment for men, but I was frankly shocked by the absence of people noticing this quite striking fact. So I think that's probably more of a moment of realizing the importance of continuing with the project than of realizing the problem.
So when you picked up on this, did you feel like this echoed or mirrored anything you saw in your lived experience, or was this something that you saw some data and the data didn't really seem to be anything you would have expected?
No, it completely echoed what I was hearing and seeing in my own lived experience. And to be clear, like this was my own experiences in a pretty affluent, with a pretty affluent background. At the time, my kids were in high school, and I'd been looking at what was happening in their high school. This is in Bethesda in the suburbs of DC, very kind of upscale economically, area. So it's not like the area where you're going to see the biggest problems. But one of the things I noticed, and this was that there was a huge difference between the private conversations that were going on about what was happening to boys and men and the public conversation about boys and men. And so you just couldn't stop people talking about, and this is across class and race lines, how worried they were about their son or their brother or their husband or whatever. Like it was just this, like it was what people were talking about in their own lives, but not what you were talking about in public. So there's this huge gap, I felt, between the kind of private discourse about boys and men and the public one. And I think a lot of my work has been motivated by a desire to close that gap and to just say, actually, this is a broad, much bigger problem. This is not just your son or your friend's son or your neighbor. This is like a structural problem. And sometimes I felt like I've been doing a version of like cognitive behavior therapy by just telling a lot of people that you're not alone. That can be quite liberating in itself.
So Joey, do you have a question you want me to?
Well, I just thought, I just for a second, I wonder, do you have sort of a shorthand diagnostic of the problem? And we talk about educational disparity, deaths of despair. There's a lot of ways you kind of frame it. Is there a way just for our listeners to hear, like when you say the problem, what are
Yeah.
you referring to? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I shouldn't say the problem if I said that. I should have said the problems. And no, I'm not going to give you a single sentence explanation, and I apologize to your listeners and to your viewers for that. It would make my life much easier and probably your life much easier if I could. But I think the truth is that what we've got is a series of overlapping problems. And some of them relate to the other and some of them don't. But I think it's a mistake actually to have this sort of monocausal obsession, right? You can see that boys are doing badly in high school right now. I can also see that there are huge problems with drug poisoning deaths, especially among middle-aged men. I can see a rise in suicide rates among young men. I can see stagnant wages for men without a college degree, and so on. Do I think they all have the same cause? No. No, what's happening in the labor market is not the same as what's happening in the education system, right? And what's happening to a 16-year-old boy today in school is very different to what's happening to a 56-year-old man in the labor market, right? Now, all of that said, and so I think it's quite important to just say, how do we make the school system more boy-friendly? How do we help men in the workplace? What's happening to dads? All of that said, I will say that I think an atmospheric connection between all of those things is a question mark about the role, the distinct role of men in a gender equal society. And I think one result of the magnificent economic rise of women has been to put a question mark next to the script that men used to be able to follow. Now, I'm not going to claim that that's why boys are struggling in high school and why their dads are struggling in the labor market and why we're losing so many young men to suicide. I think that would be simplistic. But I do think there's a sort of cultural connective tissue, if you like, that may be driving or at least contributing to some of those problems. That was not a single sentence, so you're going to have to edit that down. And if you find a way to get me on my words to make it sound simpler, then I would be thrilled, as would my communication staff.
Right. Well, it's not a single sentence, but it's a compelling explanation, and I think it's something that people can wrap their heads around. So back. Sorry to interrupt, Haroon. Go ahead. Keep.
No, no, not at all. I guess the first question I want to ask, there's so many questions I want to ask, is when you started raising this concern, and I know you've mentioned this in the past, I think to a lot of people, even when I've shared your work, there's a sort of reaction among many people, however well intentioned, that can't possibly be true. That even if they might feel it anecdotally. So I'm wondering who first responded with openness to what you were saying. Were there particular institutions, people, politicians? Like where was the audience?
Well, I think in a broad category, it was mums, especially sort of probably center left mums, or at least mums very committed to their own careers, to like the idea of gender equality generally, but who are desperately worried about their sons. I think that was a kind of key demographic, which is like I here I am, and I actually still think I'm facing problems in the workplace, say, and I'm fully committed to, the issues of women. And I'm watching my son, especially if you've got sons and daughters, but I'm watching my son and I'm like, wow, I'm really worried about him. And I think what I did was give permission in some ways to hold both those thoughts at the same time, which is to say, look, I am not asking anybody to give up their commitments to the cause of women and girls in order to say that you're not wrong to be worrying about your son. There are some real problems facing boys and men now. You're not imagining it and you're not alone. And it's okay. Right. And I did think that was a bit of an unlock moment for a lot of people. I will give some credit where it's due because it relates her indirectly to your questions. Like one of the most important conversations I've had in terms of its influence on me, but I think influence on certain groups of people, was the interview with Ezra Klein. Ezra talked about how this work is something of a narrative violation, which I think is what you're getting at, Haroon. It's like just goes against the grain, and I've used that term a lot. I think that's right. And if you're doing narrative violation work, you have to do it very carefully and empirically. But that conversation was really good, very deep, and it actually led me. It changed the trajectory of my career, honestly, because it was in that conversation with Ezra that I realized this is an institutional problem and not just an intellectual problem. And that then led me to set up a whole new institution to work on this issue. But I would say that someone like him is a kind of important sort of marker, and they reissued it. They reissued that conversation later, and a lot of people, particularly in that sort of more intellectual space. I fact this is a slight digression, but sometimes when people come up to me, they'll say, because I've done quite a lot of podcasts on this work now, people say, "Oh, I heard you on," and then I'll try and guess in my mind how they're going to finish the sentence based on how they're presenting. And so I can usually guess pretty well. Like, and I'm like, and the people who say I heard you on Ezra Klein are very different to the people who say I heard you on Theo Von. And it'd be very interesting to say, let me ask you, like if someone came up to me and said they heard me on your show, who would they be?
Dude,
Who's the median
I
listener?
was gonna ask you the opposite. Could you diagnose? Because there is definitely a moment that I heard you on a podcast. Do you think like what do I fit into? I would love to hear. What do you think?
That's really tough. Could make me do that live. I usually do it in my own head. Yeah, no, I mean you've got a sort of subject specific area, so it would be harder to pin you down, to be honest, because I've done a lot of stuff around, some of the boys and the fatherhood stuff. So I think it's kind of possible that you came through one of those routes. But
Yeah. Yeah, it was. I mean, I heard you on Ezra. That was the first one,
yeah,
and then I've
I
also heard
didn't.
you on Derek Thompson,
Yeah,
plain English
okay.
stuff.
But
Yeah.
I bet you didn't hear me on Theo Von.
Well, I get Theo Vaughn in like the social media stuff in the social media
All
feed.
right.
I don't listen to his podcast though.
Sometimes I'll if I'm in a sort of relatively age mixed audience, I'll ask people to put their hands up if they have heard of Ezra Klein, and then I'll ask them to put their hands up if they've heard of Theo Von, just to see what the overlap is in the Venn
Yeah.
diagram, and it's vanishingly narrow.
How old is the Ezra Klein demographic? Because now I'm
It's pretty
wondering.
old. It's
Pretty.
pretty
Oh
old.
man, that's
Pretty old.
rough. I mean, I guess
Yeah,
we're there. Um,
yeah, oh, totally. It's I'm sorry to say that, but if you're under 30, you probably haven't heard of Ezra Klein. Sorry, Ezra.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
I think this is so interesting. The term narrative violation, I feel, is is really compelling. I think for me, so when we first met, Richard, it was a few years back. I was just a few years into being a step parent, and so a lot of these questions were very live for me in a very just an unexpected way, right? I mean, I suppose there's, in theory you can prepare for it. In practice, you really can't, right? You're figuring out a lot in real time. And I remember the conversation that I got to hear, and you were on a stage, and you said something really beautiful, and I thought it was really profound because I sat with it, and then I found myself thinking about it and reflecting on it for weeks and months to come because it was packaged as practical, but when you realize how much work has to go into it, I think you said something. I think the question was, and I'm apologize for garbling this. What is the mark of a good man, or what would you consider a mark of a good man when it comes to your son or sons? And you said something along the lines of he'd be able to ask a girl out and to make sure she made it home safely, you know, if she said no. And at first I said, oh, that's kind of witty and fun and thoughtful. And then as I thought about it, I said, wow, there's a lot there. And I wonder how much of what you speak about is anchored in your experience as a father.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So the full quote, and I've used it a few times since, probably partly because it seemed to resonate with people. I think I actually used it on Bill Maher first, and I said, well, I've tried to raise my boys to have the courage to ask a girl out, the grace to accept no for an answer, and the responsibility to make sure that either way she gets home safely. And it's very interesting that you should mention that, Haroon, because just yesterday, as we're recording this, my son sent me a TikTok of a woman who I don't know. I'm not on TikTok, but using that quote from me, I used it again on Diary of a CEO and saying she's raising kids. So this is what I'm talking about. This is the kind of masculinity I'm talking about. Apparently, it's doing quite well on TikTok. This video, and so it does. And I've tested it on various audiences quite a bit. And what happened was that I sort of that was one of those moments where I tried to sort of take take the academic work, take the scholarly work, and kind of back it into my experience as a father, right? And it was very much that way around. Like I want to be clear that I didn't sort of, I didn't raise my kids by social science. In some ways, honestly, I really do wish I'd known a lot more then, especially when my kids were younger than I did. I think that I do think I was not made some mistakes that I think I could have avoided with this knowledge. But I also think that to some extent I was just sort of doing that instinctively. And then I realized that really did map onto the work, but in a way that I hadn't sort of thought through. And I think what that captures is a sort of willingness to take some risk, have some agency, right? That's the what was it? Someone's talking recently about thumos, this kind of Greek idea of like energy and particularly masculine energy. And in Welsh, there's a word called hwyl, Hywl, which means basically like the wind in your sails. My mum's a Welsh speaker, and so I heard that quite a lot. Hwyl, and it's so there's a bit of that. There's a bit of like agency. Then the second thing is like the second one's very important, which is no sense of entitlement at all, just to kind of know how to accept, she's not interested, you miss her, etc. I think that's incredibly important. And then the third thing is like, and we had a thing with my kids where if they were late home, but that's because they were getting someone home safely, usually a girl, we would actually just give a little bit of curfew flexibility because I do think that that's actually a good thing to do to take care of people and who are more vulnerable than me. I have to tell you, I haven't found many people who hate that model, right? Even the most progressive, like feminist young women, they don't hate that. They don't hate the idea that a guy is going to ask them out as long as he's not is doing it without entitlement. They don't hate the idea that he's just thinking a little bit about like, are you okay to get home? Like that's not a horrible vision. But I think that people have been so reluctant to even talk about that, some of those sort of virtues, that it's created a space in some ways, and maybe we'll get into this, for kind of, I think, much more reactionary views of how you're supposed to be a man. Which you've written about for us, Haroon. I mean, I think that maybe we'll get into that, but I think it's like some of the work that you've been doing with young men, and particularly kind of young Muslim men, has really been on my mind again recently in context of this TV show, Adolescence. And we're about to publish a commentary piece on that over at AIBM. But I think this kind of like, where are you getting these messages from? And the work that you've done and are doing with young men in terms of like these online influences versus these in real life influences. Actually love a kind of update from you as to like, well, how you think the culture has moved on now in terms of the work that you're doing.
Yeah, no, I think I mean I was gonna laugh. I think the challenge
Mm.
is I love the courage, grace, responsibility. I need to figure out how to map it out to a conservative Muslim community where you're going to meet her parents. So I don't know, make sure the parents make it. I don't know. I don't know how to do that. I don't know how to do that for a more not arranged, but more
Yeah.
like facilitated. It's a more like family arrangement, right? I mean, obviously that's not how a lot of people are actually in relationships, but I think it's interesting that I love the frame of courage, grace, and responsibility. And I think, when you said you used the word mistakes, I think what's interesting to me is I started I started noticing after picking up your work and thinking about what was out there in Muslim spaces, I started noticing two things. One is a lot of American Muslims seem to be pulled into the culture wars in ways that felt really inauthentic and kind of, I mean, the one thing dangerous, but also just irrelevant, right? Like certain
Mm.
frames didn't really make sense. And then the second was I noticed that, with the high schoolers I'm teaching, the boys, like that's too late to make certain interventions, right? So I started
Mm.
putting putting these considerations into the middle schoolers I teach.
Mm.
And so giving them opportunities, and it's funny, like it's a really small, silly thing, but I make them so we pray congregationally, collectively, Muslim men lead prayers, and kind of anyone can lead a prayer, and I always push a different boy to do it each time. And they usually bungle it up and they get really embarrassed. And I always say to them, I say, like, you're in a totally chill space. Like, no one's gonna make fun of you. These are all your friends. Like, I don't really care. I'm not giving you a grade. One day you'll have to go up to the mic, so to speak, and the pressure will be on, or you will be in a situation where something will be on the line. And if you've had a chance to do that beforehand, and I really think that a lot of parents don't give their boys chances to take risks
Hmm.
in unusual ways, from sports to public engagements to taking a leadership role. And I tell them, and I don't know if they think I'm nuts, I tell them like one day you're going to be a dad, very likely, or you're going to have kids in your life, and they're going to look to you to model something. So right now you're 12 years old, and this probably sounds completely bonkers and irrelevant, but hopefully it plants a seed. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the idea of like social risk taking,
Yeah.
it's a way to, it's actually can be quite a pro-social way to sort of model a willingness to take risks, right? And what I've discovered is that actually, very often that's kind of rewarded in the romantic marketplace, to use that horrible language, which is like actually you see a guy that's like willing to just put it out there a little bit, like even if he stumbles and he struggles, I think there's something the overwhelming majority of young women watching a young man try to do something and put himself out there are going to be incredibly gracious if even if it doesn't
Yeah.
he doesn't pull it off. They're going to admire him. I That's my experience anyway. But I was also reflecting a little bit on the how do you think about these values in terms of like Muslim masculinity, which you wrote that beautiful piece for us about, which I really want to recommend to people. Um, it's like there's a hadith around how many days women can travel on their own.
Mhm.
And there's this kind of argument, as you probably like, how literally to take that, or I don't know how many miles to travel on your. It's how many miles to
Yeah,
travel.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah. And as kind of a friend of mine kind of explained, well, of course, that was, written when it would take you like 2 days or something to kind of travel that many mile, right? So the question is, do you still apply it like today? And leaving aside the sort of theological discussion about how to interpret an old hadith today, of course, what's lying behind that was actually a really kind of noble thought, which is that of just protection, right?
yeah,
That the hadith wasn't written out of a sort of sense of like we must control our women, they must never leave the house. No, it was actually written out of a sense of like it's actually pretty dangerous for women to travel across the desert for 3 days on their own, right?
yeah.
And so maybe we should just like not do that. And so that was a really helpful kind of way to sort of think about that frame for me, which is that I think in some of those like what today can seem like these for very very patriarchal rules or hadiths or whatever, actually what lies behind them is probably something that's you can still argue about it, but it's like much more well intentioned than that.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think that that's really what I hope to get at with the teaching. And Joey, I know you and I have talked about this too, is that in a faith space, there's that difference between feeling a sense of responsibility for the people around you. It's exactly like you said, making sure someone gets home late at night, paying
Yeah,
attention to what's happening around you, understanding that there will be many instances when you will be expected to step up. And I think that if you can do it in a quote unquote small way when you're 12 years old, you can do it in a bigger way when you're 22 and an even bigger
exactly,
way when you're 32. And
exactly.
I think that that's something I see in a lot of immigrant Muslim communities, that we've put so much energy and effort into academic success and professional success. And I'm not knocking that, is that we forgot that certain life skills, which are arguably much more important, don't just get organically, like you have to intentionally pass them on. Like what does it mean to pay attention, right? I heard this you mentioned the manosphere thing, and kind of the online influencers. I heard this guy out in Chicago once say that, I used to laugh at my dad. He was, a recent immigrant, didn't really speak English properly, didn't know how to dress for success, shall we say. And I used to cringe when he'd show up at school. And now that I'm much older, I look at him and I say, my God, he was a man. He was married, he
Hmm.
supported his wife, he moved to another country entirely, he dedicated every kind of ounce of his time and energy and income to his family. And he never asked for attention, or, he didn't indulge anything. And he said, I don't think I could do 10% of that. And I think it's a really beautiful sense of what does it mean to show up in the moment you're in.
Yeah, I love that because you do get that sense, and I have noticed it among some immigrant men too. Maybe particularly certain groups of immigrant men. When I think about it, maybe it is more South Asian immigrant men who kind of roll their eyes at their dad, because he's like quiet and like, oh, dad, he's such a, he's sort of, and you're right, Haroon. Like all he's done is move here, build a business, take care of his family, kind of make money, make
That's
everyone
it. Yeah,
safe,
that's
get them
it.
educated. Apart from that, he's a total loser, right? But there's a kind of natural thing where like you're always going to be a bit like that with your dad. And I've had a couple of moments with my kids where the stuff I'll give you one specific example. I have this habit where, like, if I'm on a crowded train or a bus or something, and I'm standing, and someone needs to sit down, obviously, I would give my seat. That's just baked in for me. But then if I'm already standing up and somebody gets on, it needs the seat, and there are young men sitting down, I say to them, Who's going to give their seat up, guys? Go, this person, they need a seat. Could one, I say it very nicely, but hey, guys, one going to give it a seat. Almost always someone will leap to their feet, right? And I would do that with my sons when they were young, and they would be like, Dad, that's so embarrassing. Can you stop doing that? And I was like, no, someone's got to do it, right? I'm sorry. Like, there's almost like they almost wanted someone to do it, if that makes sense. They wanted permission. They just wanted someone to break the ice a little bit and just say, hang on. And they could just go, oh, God, I'm so sorry. And they'd jump up. Anyway, my 24-year-old son, I'm with him a few weeks ago. We're on a crowded train. Somebody gets on who needs a seat. There are some young men sitting down. My 24-year-old son said, hey, guys, is one of you going to get up? And I'm like, my work here is done.
You've done it.
And he said, you know what? You're absolutely right, Dad. And he just started doing it. I never told them they had to do it, and we never had a conversation about it. They just saw me doing it, and they've gone from being cringingly embarrassed by it to doing it themselves. And if that isn't fatherhood, I don't know what is.
I love that. I love that so much. I think we all have these moments also when we start doing the things that our fathers did to us or for us, and like, where did that come from? That somehow like innate, it's been baked within you. The question that I had is, I've heard you mentioned scripts already. I've heard you talk about scripts a fair amount, and the level to which like our masculine scripts are socially constructed, how
Yeah.
improvisational kind of scripts are a little more difficult for boys, it seems to be. um I can't help but think about how the script that Haroon has in the Islamic context is distinct but connected to the script that maybe you have for your boys. And so the question that I had for you was, do you have any guidance for dads, for parents, as they're thinking about constructing a social script for their boys?
Yeah, I always struggle with these sorts of questions because you're worried about sounding prescriptive, right? But I also think that sometimes the concern about sounding prescriptive means that no one ever says anything, and they just end up saying, "Oh, well, everyone's different." Well, of course, everyone's different, but I think there are certain guidelines that you should follow, and I'll connect it to a broader issue. So it relates a bit to the story I just told, which is be of service, give more than you get, uh, be a generator of a surplus of one thing or another. And I think it speaks to like the dads Haroon was just talking about, which is, I think I'm really convinced that there is a pretty fixed idea in culture where the transition from boy to man is transition from consumer to producer. Now, what you produce is going to be very different, right? I think there's this idea of a surplus, right? And you can think about in different contexts that would be, and this really relates to fatherhood. It's one of the reasons fathers were invented because of the calorific requirements of these kids that we have so early. But it's like you have to get more meat for the tribe than you need, right? You can't, if you just kill enough meat for yourself, then you're not a man. Not ancestrally, not like in the right. You have to generate a surplus because there are women and there are children who are kind of calorifically like massively demanding, and you cannot hunt in the same way. Now, I'm not suggesting, of course, that that's the same today. The surplus today could be of something else, and even in the post-war economy, it could be money, could be energy, could be time, could be love, could be service, could be all kinds of things. But that sense of service and serving others, I think, is absolutely massive. And I think that can just take different forms. But I think that that's the golden line, which is to and I think about my own sons and kind of how they've grown up. It's like when am I most proud of them? And it's not when they've achieved certain academic things or made a certain got a promotion. Of course, I'm proud of them. I'm proud of them when I see them as surplus generation, as doing more, as serving others, as caring for, providing for, protecting, serving. All right. I actually wrote a piece uh, for Anne Snyder Brooks's magazine comment on the difference between relational masculinity and kind of and Lone Ranger masculinity. I think there's this movement online of like mugged out men going their own way, and I use that as an example. Like men who are going their own way are not men, like by any cultural definition, right? If you are just out for yourself, you are not a grown-ass man. You are still a child. And I think that idea of kind of relationship and service is really what drives a lot of work. And it's what what I worry about now is that this is a really new, it's growing concern for me. The lack of men showing up in various service spaces, religious spaces, civic spaces, volunteering. I've just signed up to be a big through Big Brothers Big Sisters, where I live in East Tennessee. There's a 12-month waiting list for boys compared to a 3-month waiting list for girls because they don't have enough men. That turns out to be true across the country. That we don't have enough YMCA volunteers, we don't have enough scout leaders, we don't have enough mentors. A lot of these programs, they don't have the men. And so I do think there needs to be a call to men to do these roles, and it needs to be specifically to men. The call can't be we need volunteers. The call has to be we need men. And that's maybe not an uncontroversial thing to say, but I've become really convinced that unless there's a specific call to men, which is we need you as men to come do this thing and provide this surplus, this service, then I think we lose them quite profoundly.
Before Haroon, just before you say something, I mean, also we need male teachers, we need male therapists, we need I mean, it extends beyond just the volunteer kind of civic atmosphere.
Absolutely. Those are classic sort of service providing roles, right? My son, the 24-year-old I just mentioned, is now a fifth grade teacher in Baltimore City. He struggled through education himself, and like I got to tell you, like of all, I'm proud of all my sons. I'm proud of what they do, but there's something to me about the idea of this kid who's like struggled himself a little bit through the education system. He's like 6'4" now. He's coaching the girls' middle school soccer team as well. And half of them never played soccer before. And it's like they just like literally just like all run after the ball. Like I don't care. So he's a 6'4" white British guy teaching in kind of Baltimore cities at the front of the class. He loves it and he's amazing at it. And there's something really beautiful about that. It's just the same with like my eldest son. He's just kind of bought a house, and his girlfriend is like struggling. You know, she's just in a little bit of a career transition thing right now, and so he's been able to sort of make that happen for them. And I just like when I see things like that happening, you know, one of those is maybe looks a bit more traditional than the other, but what I'm seeing is just yeah, yeah. These guys are just they're giving it, and that's amazing.
This episode is brought to you by Queen City Diwan. We build experiences, adventures, and retreats for travelers of all ages and backgrounds. We design journeys so you can take friends and family and make friends and family, because we believe who you travel with and who you become along the way matters just as much as where you go. This September, we'll be in Uzbekistan. In October, we're leading a remarkable pilgrimage across Saudi Arabia. And in January, we're offering a leadership retreat exclusively for college students, a journey across Andalusia, helping students connect with their heritage, discover their purpose, and realize their incredible potential. Visit queencitydiwan.com to find out how you can join an unforgettable adventure with me, your co-host, Haroon. Yeah, what I love about that is, you talk about different models, and you touched on this this question of the danger of the prescriptive, and I fully hear you, but something it's been kind of lodged in my mind is, I'm not talking about culture from an essentialist point of view, let alone from an ethnocentric point of view, but lived experiences, which I mean historically did map out over religion, culture, language, geography for obvious reasons, right? To
Yeah.
your point, we couldn't really travel that far in, so many days. Um, I've noticed that the way cultures do certain things offer us lessons, and I'll give you a simple example, and I don't know how we can highlight that, or I'm looking for a way to highlight that. So when I moved out here to Cincinnati, not that far from you, I guess, on an American
Hmm.
scale, uh, and like you said, right, like, it's funny, like I never really played team sports, and now I got three kids who love sports, and God has a sense of humor sort of thing.
Hmm.
And when our youngest, he's now 13, when he was about 8, 9 years old, he played basketball, loved basketball, and these teams were absolutely hilarious because they would be fully 30% of the team didn't know that dribbling was a thing. Many of them didn't understand that the basket stayed on the same side of the court for half of the game. Like it was amazing, right? And then I'd start to meet these coaches, and they're all successful men in different kind of ways. And I remember one year with this just absolutely amazing collection of small young men playing basketball, air quotes. And the coach was C-suite executive at Pepsi. And I got to talking to him and basically, intuited that and he wasn't saying it in the sense of like I'm just forced to be here, but like this is something my church and my company expect. And it's a kind of calling, it's a marker of professional
Hmm.
responsibility, and like you can't show your face in the office. And here's a dude who I'm sure has a lot going on and probably doesn't want to be spending 4 hours theoretically, coaching, kids who whatever, right? And
Hmm.
but I'm like, and I was really moved by that like he didn't have to do that, quote unquote, but it's a culture. And I guess my question is, and it's a very long-winded way of saying it,
Hmm.
is how do we bring back the prescriptive without the judgment and the harshness, but with the motivation and the expectation?
Yeah. That's a beautiful story. I love that. I love that. And I think it's exactly what we're after, isn't it? It's where there's just an ethos and an expectation of service,
Yeah.
right? Of going above and beyond, of giving more than you get, being the mark of a kind of responsible, like a grown-ass adult man, right? Is like giving stuff. I love that. So I think for me, the way I think about it, and I don't know how helpful this is, and don't even know if it's a direct answer to your question, but I think because we get caught up on the kind of I think I'm willing to be very prescriptive about the fact that dudes need to show up and do stuff, right? And so, like, in terms, like, just very narrowly fatherhood, right? If you've got kids, whether they're kind of your kids or stepkids, or if your kids in your life, you have a moral responsibility to be engaged with providing for in various ways those kids, period. Right. Just, I think that's just an inescapable moral duty. But I also think there's would I go as far as saying duty? I don't know. But I think there is a moral responsibility on adult men, to be of service to the tribe. And I think precisely because there's a slightly different role for men and women in reproduction, I think the tribal bit of the responsibility is even more important. And it reminds me a little bit of it's another Chetty finding, actually, this kind of really striking finding that in low-income neighborhoods, that was specifically looking at kind of mostly looking at black neighborhoods, where there were lots of dads around. The boys did better, even if their own dad wasn't around. Right. So you might say, okay, well, obviously, neighborhoods where there's lots of fathers, that's because that means lots of sons have got their dads around, right? That's true. What they also found was even the boys whose fathers were not around did better in neighborhoods where there were lots of dads around. Don't know why exactly, but I think it's plausible to suggest it's because those dads were doing some fathering of other people's kids, right? That fatherhood isn't just found in the family. Fatherhood, actually, properly defined, is a tribal thing. And so your Pepsi executive is being a father to those kids, right? They're not his. And so the unlock for me is to be prescriptive about the need to be of service without saying it has to be this way. Right. I do think that like when I think about myself, like I was a stay-at-home dad for a while, right? While my wife was the kind of main breadwinner. And I'd like to think I was doing well by my kids and organizing their play dates and all the rest of it. But I also became a scout leader, a mentor, organized some of the school trips. The scout thing was huge, camping trips, doing all that stuff together, kind of got involved with the school, etc. And so I like to think that I was still like meeting that ethos of being. I didn't say I'm just a stay-at-home dad. I said, okay, so what do I do for the tribe as well, right? And so I think I was in many ways, as good a provider and as good a surplus generator when I was primarily the primary parent as when I was the primary breadwinner, which I've also done.
Yeah, I have a question that's connected to what we're talking about, but maybe just like a little twist to the knob. I've heard you quote Margaret Mead a couple different times about this idea
Mhm.
that boys can learn nurturing behavior. And I know
Yeah.
you're, I'm going to ask another prescriptive question here, so go for it. But
Okay.
what would it look like, or what advice would you have for parents with boys? I know this is a larger institutional question. It's about relational norms, about a larger picture, but in terms of parenting specifically, are there any kind of specific pushes or guidance you would have to help boys learn nurturing behavior?
Yeah, this is going to sound a bit, maybe a little bit counterintuitive, but first of all, like obviously the first thing is just they believe their eyes, not their ears, right? So I mean, I've given examples, right? They're just watching what you do, above all, and they're watching what the other men in their lives do. And that's one of the reasons why I've said quite a lot that the best antidote to an unserious or even reactionary online male figure is a serious, in real life, flesh and blood man right in front of them in the mosque, in the classroom, in the church, in the neighborhood, on the coach's bench. Like coaches are just mental health professionals, mentors, and dads in disguise rolled into one, right? Coaches are just like amazing. Um, but the counterintuitive bit is, I think, try and find ways to get them into some all male spaces because I've really come to believe that the all male spaces that are provided through, say, some religious groups or through things like Boy Scouts, although that doesn't exist anymore. It's now Scouting for America and has gone co-ed, which is something I've talked about. But at YMCA groups, team sports, I think this is very important because I actually think that it's easier for boys to learn that sort of nurturing, especially in that sort of group sense with other boys. Uh, and actually, I think the same thing is true in a different way for single sex spaces for girls. I think actually, if you look at what Girl Scouts do and those what typically those all female spaces do, they really prioritize being assertive, being, encouraging competition, etc. In other words, to put it very bluntly, Girl Scouts don't spend a huge amount of time telling girls they need to be more caring, more nurturing, and more emotionally available and there for each other. They spend a lot of time on STEM, assertiveness, leadership, competitiveness, right? Because it doesn't come quite as naturally to girls, right? And the same is true the other way around. Like in Boy Scout groups or in male teams, you don't use the same language, but what you're actually teaching them to do is love each other, look out for each other, nurture each other, be part of something bigger than yourself. It's not all about the competition, it's about the team. It's not just about you, it's about them. And so actually what you're learning through those all male spaces is how to be more nurturing, how to be more caring, how to be more emotionally available, right? You don't necessarily use that language. And so in a perverse way, I think those single sex spaces help us to lean against and fill out, I think, some of those more masculine and feminine traits rather than going against them. And I think it's therefore a tragedy that we're losing some of those all male spaces. But that's what I would do if I was a parent. Find male teachers, find all male scout groups, find male coaches. They need a crew.
So, when you talk about these different initiatives, ways in which people can show up, men can show up and should show up, I'm wondering, it's been some time now since your ideas have entered the national conversation. They have, and I think they've entered a global conversation as well. Are there particular people or spaces where you see that there has been positive change that we might learn from or want to highlight, or maybe conversely, there's places where you think that we're missing the point?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I would say that I'm really excited by the growing permission space around this issue. My goal was to mainstream this issue. My goal was to take this from, like, I mean, I think we may have talked about this, Haroon, but like I couldn't get a publisher for my book. And that seems weird to say now, right?
Yeah.
Right. But it was true. And so I think that the issue is getting mainstreamed, and that excites me. And so I've been very excited by certain policymakers and political leaders taking it up. I was very, very encouraged that Melinda French Gates picked me out as someone to get some philanthropic support as part of her gender equality push. And so I think what's happening is there's a kind of growing realization that this is not an issue we should be ignoring. And that should be true in a non-partisan way. So I'm very, very encouraged by that. I have noticed that there's been a real rhetorical time towards the importance of things like, Joey, you talk about male teachers and kind of men in those professions. I am hearing a lot more people saying that now. Now, that doesn't mean it's happening yet. That doesn't mean we've got policies yet. But I'm aware that this takes time, and the step one is raise awareness, broaden the permission space, get some action, see what actions work, etc. It takes a bit of time, but I would say directionally that's been really, really useful. In terms of people that have kind of gotten the wrong end of the stick, I don't think by and large that's happened very much, to be honest. I think that most of the conversation about this is really pretty positive. I would say. I this is going to sound ridiculous, but I sort of like, if I've got roughly the same number of fringe people accusing me of being like a cuck and having to ask my wife's boyfriend's permission to go out, which I sometimes get on that side. And I've got the kind of, men's rights, activist in disguise from the other side. So as long as they're roughly equal, A, that they're roughly equal, and B, that they are very much just on the fringes, it's fine. Like, I don't think that anybody in good faith can think these aren't real issues. And isn't honestly kind of struggling with it. And I've come to actually, it's very interesting. This process has made me much more optimistic and feel much better about the future of our culture, which is weird to say, because actually the overwhelming majority of people act in good faith, listen in good faith, disagree in good faith, and want a better world for everybody, boys and men, right? Anybody who doesn't, it's the fringes who don't believe all of that. So I would say that the tone of the conversation around boys and men has really shifted in a overwhelming and much more positive direction. The challenge, frankly, is, okay, where's the action? And that's why I'm excited by governors picking this up. Wes Moore, Gretchen Whitmer, Spencer Cox, really starting to say, okay, well, what can we do at a state level to help this stuff? And so I think that's where we'll start to see the real policy action. And then on the cultural side, it just excites me to have this conversation and to engage with lots of fathers groups and men's groups and others who are just authentically trying to figure this stuff out.
So I wanted to share with you a small story going back to the practical here. I have a 6-year-old little boy who is just a wild man. He's a wild man. And the way that I have been sort of intervening with discipline or redirection up until when I heard you speak was by forcing him to look me in my eye, because I perceive that as a sign of respect, right? Respect is big, right? And making sure he comprehends that we're on the same page. When he looks away, I say, no, look at me in my eye. And I heard you say in one of the many interviews I've heard you speak about the importance of being shoulder to shoulder, looking in the same direction as opposed to face. And that has shifted the way that I intervene with my son now. I mean, particularly around discipline, but just in general, whenever I'm trying to have a significant conversation with him, I'm now sitting next to him with my arm around him. I'm not forcing him to stare in my eyes the entire time. And I just wanted to maybe a little bit of why that's important from you. And I'm hoping for like one real practical tool for dads and moms as they're relating to their sons.
Yeah. So, well, thank you for sharing that story. That's beautiful. And a wild 6-year-old boy is not unheard of in human history. So you'll be all right. For sure. It's very interesting. So I don't want to be misunderstood when I use that analogy of shoulder to shoulder. Like, I think it's incredibly important people do learn to look each other in the eye. I think that's incredibly important as a mark of respect and confidence too. But I think it's just also true that, like, boys and young men especially, it's just a more threatening pose than it is for women, right? I think that's pretty well proven now. And so what that means is just like if you're trying to have a conversation, if you're trying to kind of open up, then staring boys and young men in the face is not the best way to do that. It sets their threat level up. I think there's some evidence that cortisol goes up. It's kind of like a fight. It's like a fight stance for boys and men. And so actually just more naturally conversations will flow when you're shoulder to shoulder. I think actually we've just published a piece on video gaming. I think there's a little bit of that there. Driving, fishing, walking, hiking. It's the only explanation that I've been able to find for golf. Is it's just an opportunity for men to do stuff shoulder to shoulder, right? There's no other explanation for it, culturally speaking. And so I think and that's just true, right? And so if you're a parent, like, and you're trying to interact with your boy or kind of your son, like, don't think that the only serious conversation, the only way you're gonna have a serious conversation is face to face, right? We're just talking now. No, no, no. Go for a walk, get in the car, sit on the bleachers, etc. Say how you doing, like this, shoulder to shoulder, and you'll probably get. It's just a less threatening way into the conversation. It's quite a threatening way to get into it if you just stare at them. Now, that doesn't mean, as I said, you've got to be able to look them in the eye and all of that. But just a true difference in the way that girls and women interact with each other. They're much more comfortable face to face. I invite your listeners now to go in next time you go into a coffee shop, look around and count how many people in that coffee shop are staring each other in the face across the table, and then do a gender breakdown. It's not that there's never any men, but like the idea of sitting and staring at your friend for like 2 hours over a cup of coffee. I'm sorry, I'm not doing that. My wife would do it, no problem. And it's a difference on average. And so it's just how do you create an environment that is conducive to open communication? And there's just a bit of a gender difference about that. And it's important that mothers and fathers and teachers and therapists, I've really noticed a lot of therapists will now just go for a walk with their male patients, sitting them down and staring at them in the therapy room doesn't always work. And it's one of the reasons why it's important to have more male teachers and male coaches and male therapists, because they don't need to be told that. They just kind of know that.
Thank you. Joey, that was a great question. Now I'm in turn questioning every decision I've ever made. So that's what
me too. That's right. Yeah.
When you've asked a good question. I'm gonna ask a question that flips things a little bit on their head. So I struggled with a lot of the question of myself, masculinity, who I was supposed to be in the world. I think my mom passed away when I was kind of young. They were, again, immigrant parents. They did more than anyone could ask, from so many perspectives. They lit a fire under me academically, professionally. I mean, I when I was young, I used to resent that my dad would say, like, you're either going to Harvard or you're going to Yale. But on reflection, it was fascinating that, here's a person of color not far removed from colonization who genuinely thinks that, his son can go to, one of the two best universities in the world. And there are other great universities too, but you know what I mean, right? Like there was that sense that you can do this and you should, and no one should be able to stop you, right? And in retrospect and hindsight, that's incredible. But something I really struggled with, like I think a lot of American Muslims of immigrant origin, or maybe just a lot of Americans in general, is the question of marriage and, who to settle down with and how to make those choices. And that was really, really hard because there were a lot of conflicting messages, what made sense for them. My dad literally, I think he just called up his sister when he wanted to get married and asked her to find him a wife. And she said, "What are you looking for?" And I still remember the story. She should know how to make naan, and she should pray. And those were literally his two, considerations, right? So long story short, it's when I got married just about 5 years ago and came to Cincinnati. I think I finally found my footing and figured out who I meant to be. And, there's no reason it would have happened this way. And I think as I look back on it, that probably the most important decision in my life has been who I've chosen to spend my life with. And I think that sometimes, at least in some spaces, we don't really talk about the importance of that. So I started bringing that up with the boys I teach. I also teach high school girls. I bring it up for obvious reasons more with the boys, who to look for, what to look for. And I started to write about it. And I'd write about what does it take? Like you said, we live in a very different age where a lot of these things aren't, just kind of rites of passage. You have to choose them, right? If you want to choose them, you have to choose them, that kind of thing. And so I've been writing and found like a really enthusiastic response for what do I think young men need to know to get married? And then this is a very long question. I promise you there's a point. And then someone wrote me, privately and said, can you write one for women? And I said, well, for obvious reasons, I cannot. I'm not the person who should do that. But I want to turn it around to you. And you had that beautiful kind of trifecta: courage, grace, responsibility. what would you say to a young woman who's looking like what should a young woman perhaps look for in a man in an era when we don't have always the clearest expectations? Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Well, thank you for sharing that. That's actually really beautiful. I think I probably would sort of go back to those three. I mean, I used courage in that trifecta, but it's both courage and agency, I think. I think that the sense that he's kind of like you said, fire under you, but like I use that Welsh word wheel, which means wind in your sails or thum. I think kind of just to kind of get a sense of like this is a guy that's like agentic. I think like that's almost slightly independently of what he's being agentic about at that particular moment in time, but just a kind of sense of like there's a sense of purpose there. I think passivity. Like if you just get the sense of like doesn't really know what to do, doesn't know where to eat, doesn't have views about what we should watch. It's like that, those are real markers, I think. I think passivity is a real warning sign. I think of like and actually young women have sort of said to me like I the worst answer a young man can give to a young woman who says, "What do you want to do tonight?" is I don't know, whatever you want. You decide. Right, just to have no view, no sense of like this is sort of hunger, I think, forget about agency. I think that's true. Of course, kindness, grace. I mean, like as this is obvious, but kindness going like a huge, huge, huge distance. I think what's interesting, in this, it's not really my theme. Christine Embo's on our board, has written a lot about dating. And I think that that whole issue of the dating market, like I'm 55, I've been married for a quarter of a century, and so I'm very much removed from this, except through my own sons. But I do get this sort of sense that there's an appetite among young women for young men who do have some of those kind of markers of what we might think of as quotes traditional masculinity about courage, about risk, about agency, and about a sort of sense of responsibility and so on. But they also want them to be incredibly supportive of their prospects and their careers. And so it's like it's very interesting. They're not looking for there's this trad wives like trad husbands, right? But they're looking for an element of what came along with those traditional things. I've been like, maybe I should finish with this. It's very interesting. Like you get these cultural moments where I was talking to this woman recently. She's an incredibly professional, she's a very successful lawyer. And she and her husband have started going to this salsa dance class thing. And she said she went in and like to start with, like the man has to lead, right? And I think I don't know what husband does, whether he's stay at home or whatever, but the man has to lead. And I said, well, she's a real feminist. And I said, well, God, you must hate that, right? Gosh, how patriarchal and sexist. She said, it's so nice. I spend all day making decisions, etc. And I just love the fact that my husband leads. And that's okay. It's okay to have these kind of cultural moments where it's like, fine, like just dance and lead. And then I think what women are kind of saying is like, I don't have to stop being a woman in order to be CEO. And I don't need the men that I'm going to marry or date to stop being men just to support me being CEO or being a. And so I think we're really in this moment now. We're trying to find a way to kind of bring out what's beautiful and distinct about men and women without falling into traps about what that means we can and can't do. I think it's messy, this transition. I think it's really difficult for a lot of boys and men. But I think that that's the kind of transition we're going through. And the question is whether that conversation is going to be framed by and led by people of good faith or not. And because of the reluctance of too many people to have this conversation, a conversation like this, right, where we're thinking out loud, we're saying stuff, has just created a really dangerous vacuum in our culture. And that is a vacuum that we need to fill. There's a lovely line from Richard Reeves, the Catholic theologian. It's specifically about men. And it's about under-socialized, under-fathered men, actually, where he says you end up creating a vacuum. And then he says, and into a vacuum, demons will pour. That's exactly right. We've created a vacuum, and if you have a vacuum, demons will pour into those vacuums. And so the question is like, so I want angels filling that vacuum now, not the demons. Like you.
Thanks for listening, and thanks to Zach Swellbar for recording our theme music. If you enjoyed this episode, please don't forget to like and subscribe, and let us know what questions we should be asking and who else we should be talking to. Next episode, we'll be talking to Shadi Hamid about the apocalypse and what's being revealed in this moment of history.